Immediately after the fires, a lot of people stepped up to help survivors with donations, grants, gifts, and massive fundraisers. And now there are questions about where all that money went. From Los Angeles Times Studios, this is Rebuilding LA. I'm Kate Cagle. This summer, one of the biggest fundraisers for fire survivors came under intense scrutiny, the Fire Aid benefit in January. And it was a pretty big deal, a massive concert organized by Clippers owner Steve Ballmer and his wife. The acts included Billie Eilish, Olivia Rodrigo, Joni Mitchell, Gracie Abrams, No Doubt, and Green Day, so many more. This event raised $100 million, and though Fire Aid organizers quickly announced the first round of grants, that happened in February, a lot of people from residents all the way up to elected officials are asking how that money was spent, saying that it did not go to those directly affected by the fires. Even President Trump turned his attention to the concert, calling the event a, quote, Democrat-inspired scam. So what's going on? Los Angeles Times reporter August Brown covers the music industry and has been writing all about this. He's here in the studio. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Well, this certainly wasn't the first benefit concert that's ever been organized, but give us a little bit more of the history or the backstory behind Fire Aid.
Well, the one thing that was very notable in the early days of the fires was that, particularly within the music industry and the music community here in LA, there were a lot of successful studio owners and executives and, home recording enthusiasts that live in the Palisades, and a lot of working class artists, especially kind of either, older Black, jazz artists. There's a thriving community for that in Altadena, and kind of younger folk and rock musicians that live out there too. So these are two very important music neighborhoods in LA that were kind of uniquely devastated by these fires. I know in my own reporting, you heard just countless stories of, there was a spreadsheet going around of artists that had lost their homes, and it was dozens and dozens and dozens of names long. So it's not surprising that, that wealthy people with kind of connections to the music industry recognized that need very quickly. And that included, Steve Ballmer that owns the Clippers and Irving Azoff, who, the mega manager and music mogul who, kind of used the resources at hand at the Intuit Dome and Kia Forum to kind of pull from the music industry to try and, stanch some of the wounds that this community had suffered overnight in such a unfathomable tragedy. And to their credit, it was a pretty quick turnaround on this concert. I think within just a couple of weeks, they were able to pull, so many A-list names to perform, including some musicians that had lost their homes in the fires. I know the band Dawes, they lost a couple of homes in the Eaton fire, and they performed at Fire Aid a couple of weeks after that tragedy.
And Gracie Abrams is from the Palisades, right?
Right. She spoke. Yeah, she spoke about kind of the loss out there, and the concert, brought out a lot of non-musician families just to talk about how immediately, they had to evacuate with the clothes on their back and lost everything, and now were faced with rebuilding their lives, not just losing their home, but losing their neighborhood, losing their schools, losing everything. Tragedy really touched the music industry in a very unique way because it happened in the backyard of Los Angeles, and everyone in the music knew somebody that lost something. And it was really powerful to see how quickly the community did come together to pull this concert off.
And just how many people attended and saw the concert?
It happened at the Kia Forum in the Intuit Dome, the kind of the bright new arena in Inglewood. Get about 15,000, 20,000 people in those venues, and tickets were expensive, but they were for a good cause and raised I think like $100 million between Steve Ballmer's donations and merch and ticket sales, and musicians all donated their time, and that money within a matter of days was already beginning to circulate within the community of people that lost everything in those fires.
Right. So pretty soon after this big successful concert, they raised $100 million. Then they announced that the money was going to start going out into the community. So what can you tell us about that first round of money that was given out?
So I think this was an early misconception about what this concert was doing, was that from day one, they chose to partner with, the Annenberg Foundation as a kind of giving consultant, and the focus was not on individuals getting their homes rebuilt. It was to go to established nonprofits to provide really immediate on-the-ground need with things like childcare, with things like food aid, with things like mental health, with things like navigating the legal morass that people were going to be facing to get permits and insurance claims paid out to help interface with FEMA. These were services that people were in desperate need of navigating right now. And they made a decision early on that rather than give out money directly to homeowners, that there was going to be to provide the social services that people needed to stay above water and have a path forward to rebuilding their financial stability and take care of their families and find places to live, clothes to wear, food to eat in the days immediately after the fires. I think that's kind of became a common misconception among some corners of media that, people maybe expected it to go to other services or provide immediate cash grants, which there were some. You could apply to local organizations that would give cash grants to employees at affected businesses. But yeah, they made a decision to go early on to go to established nonprofits rather than individuals pretty quickly.
Well, and I do think some of the misconception was fueled by the concert itself, because you heard these harrowing stories from individuals and you felt like your money was going to go help these people directly. So I think maybe that was some of the surprise when people found out that it wasn't going to be just cash out to folks.
Sure. And a lot of the organizations that, were getting fire aid grants did give cash and did give resources and did give kind of directly to affected families. It's not like it's into some kind of unaccountable slush fund or anything. Yeah. But people donated on the premise that, this money is going to go to affected families. And it did. It went through a layer of established nonprofits that frankly knew how to get the money into people's hands very quickly rather than fire aid themselves trying to figure out how to do this in an accountable, effective way. They went to people that already knew how to do that.
I want to back up a little bit and talk to me about how you were able to follow the money and find out that it did indeed go to survivors.
Well, we went and asked every single group that got a fire aid grant directly. I think I emailed well over 100 organizations and spoke to the vast majority of them about how much they got, when did they get it, what did they use it for, and what their experience was working with fire aid. And to the letter, all of the groups had pretty kind things to say about working with fire aid. They kept a pretty good ledger of, what they had received and noted what it had been used for. And whether it be, I talked to some businesses that got burned down in the Palisades and were like, we got grants to give, cash donations to affected employees that lost all their work. I talked to the LA Regional Food Bank to be like, we were able to hire a bunch more forklift operators to help deal with the flood of donations that we got in the wake of the fires and help more expeditiously get them to the regional partners to get it into people's hands. I talked to youth mental health services, with kids that have suddenly, lost their home, lost their school, had a lot of displaced friends. Obviously, they needed mental health services quickly, and they, these grants were able to hire a bunch of social workers and therapists to, assist them in a real time of need.
There was a yoga instructor too, right?
Oh, yeah, there was a woman that owned an exercise studio out there.
The White Lotus.
Right, yeah, who, lost everything in the Palisades fire. And, they were able to get some cash grants out to affected employees and, reopen in a smaller studio nearby. These are not just individuals that lost homes. These are entire economies. These are, day laborers that, are gardening in the Palisades that suddenly have nowhere to garden because it's all cinders. What fire aid was smart about is recognizing that very quickly, that this isn't just, oh, if you lost a home, here's money to rebuild it. It's we have to respond to people that suddenly lost livelihoods, that lost communities, that lost the ability to sustain themselves. And, by, I think, prioritizing things like social services and, the local economy as much as kind of individual residents, they recognize that we need people to be able to hang on for a month, 6 months, a year, and have a path forward to rebuilding their lives in the wake of such long-standing devastation in their neighborhoods. And that, I think, is the misconception about kind of what fire aid was doing. It wasn't just about rebuilding. It's about allowing people to keep their lives afloat as they try to figure out a path forward. And the nonprofits that they worked with were focused on that as much as simply rebuilding structures that were lost.
So I'm picturing you with your giant Excel spreadsheet of all these organizations and your phone calls. And of course, you're a reporter. We're known for looking for scandals, but once you called all these organizations, it seemed like the money went to some good places.
Right. And obviously, people can have their thoughts about, did FireAid prioritize the right organization? Should they have done something differently? It's all fair to ask. I'm sure even FireAid would say the same of, they were making a lot of decisions with a lot of money very quickly in the face of an insane tragedy and like a world of desperate need. But the money got to where they said it was going to go to. And you can wonder if they made all the right choices. But, every organization that I talked to said the grant arrived very quickly, and they were accountable for it. And the money went to the services that their organization were providing and promised to provide. And it's not as visible necessarily as like we rebuilt a home overnight, but it is, we provided therapy to a bunch of displaced kids with money that we got from this charity. You're not going to necessarily see that as a FireAid viewer, but if you're an affected, teenager in the Palisades or in Altadena that suddenly had someone to talk to about losing your home, that made all the difference in the world. And I think that's something that maybe is less visible to the audience than the concert itself.
One of the typical complaints I've been hearing about this model was people always bring up nonprofit overhead and they have executives. But it sounds like you were able to even get accounting for how this money was spent, that it didn't go to executive salaries or things like that.
Right. Most of the charities and nonprofits that I talked to accounted. We got, a $50,000 grant and it bought X, Y, and Z with that money. One kind of tragic angle in that is, especially in the Eaton fire, is a lot of the nonprofits that were tasked with helping people lost facilities, that people that worked for these nonprofits also lost their homes. Being able to have some of this cash grant to just simply continue the work that they were doing beforehand was a great aid because you're dealing with displaced people tasked with helping displaced people. So to some degree, simply being able to keep the lights on at the organization with that cash grant had a multiplier effect because now they were able to help people as opposed to just being like, we're all adrift, we can't do our jobs anymore, sorry. So maybe there's some misconception around the money, going to enrich executives at these nonprofits, which to the best of my reporting, it didn't. It went to groups that were already doing work, being able to either continue doing that work or amplify the work that they were doing. And we're talking about, the LA Regional Food Bank getting $1 million to suddenly be able to have a force multiplier to get more food out the door to people. Have your thoughts about that, but I don't think that's what some angles of the media are portraying it as.
Yeah, and we're going to get into how this ballooned into a national scandal in a little bit. But I do want to ask you about some of the local concerns we heard. We spoke to State Senator Sasha Renee Perez, who represents Altadena, and she was echoing some of her constituents' concerns about the money, including from FireAid, that maybe Altadena didn't see its fair share because people donating funds, maybe because they didn't understand that Altadena is not part of the city of LA or because of equity. And she was even encouraging LA County Board Chair Catherine Barger to look into it.
So one thing that I think is interesting is you see the $100 million top line figure. That sounds like a ton of money, raised really quickly. That can do a lot of good. $100 million is a drop in the bucket compared to the need that these communities are facing, from the immediate needs of just keeping people alive and surviving and finding places to go to the soil remediation and testing that you're going to need before you can even get permits to rebuild to, rebuilding schools in some of the most expensive places in the country. $100 million, doesn't go as far as you think it would. And I think, Altadena's got a right to ask, did, we get a fair shake of our priorities? And, based on my reporting, it did feel pretty evenly split. I mean, I've heard from Altadena residents and I've heard from Palisades residents that each feel like they got the short end of the FireAid donation funds and priorities. And in time, maybe there'll be a better ledger of kind of exactly where the equity in that amount went. Really, it's not enough to solve a lot of the problems that I think people are looking to solve, which is how do we rebuild a community that vanished off the map overnight?
That's a great point. We're going to get more into the politics of all this and how it got national attention when we come back. But first, let's take a quick break.
California ratepayers face some of the nation's highest electricity costs, with a decades-old solar policy at the center of debate. Net energy metering was introduced in the 1990s to boost rooftop solar by letting homeowners sell excess power back to the grid at full retail rates. But now, the California Public Advocate's Office reports that households without solar are subsidizing those with rooftop systems through higher electricity rates. The Fix the Cost Shift Coalition points out that this shift has led to equity concerns. Solar adoption concentrates among higher-income homeowners, while costs burden renters and lower-income families. Assemblymember Lisa Calderon authored legislation to address the cost shift while maintaining solar incentives at 76 to 82% of current levels. Support Assemblymember Calderon and help fix California's electricity crisis. Learn more at fixthecostshift.org. That's fixthecostshift.org. California lawmakers, big oil is slick. Don't slip. Big oil lobbyists are working hard to roll back climate and clean energy progress to keep their profits soaring and California hooked on their dirty, expensive energy. We can't afford to slip on big oil's slick PR and lobbying. Keep California moving forward with affordable, clean energy and transportation. Learn more at don'tslipca.org, paid for by California environmental voters.
All right, we are back with August Brown, who covers music for the Los Angeles Times. So this all escalated to the point where it even got a truth post from the President of the United States, Donald Trump, calling it a scam. And this was all linked to a state senator in California, Kevin Cagle, who called for an investigation by the Department of Justice. Where does that all stand now?
I was kind of surprised this became a national right-wing kind of meme that, the Fire Aid concert was a scam. And I think it became sort of an article of faith in certain circles that this money disappeared, that it did not go to where Fire Aid said it was going to go to, and that, maybe at best it was misallocated, that there was this outpouring of generosity and that their goals were mistaken. And, again, you can have thoughts about the organizations that they chose, but based on my reporting and based on the organizations that I talked to, is the $100 million did make it out the door and it did make it to where they said it was going to go to. I think, this was such a complex and fast-moving moment of tragedy, and I think, it's kind of hard to explain away like how some of the most wealthy and visible kind of neighborhoods in Los Angeles and in the country can just vanish overnight. And I think kind of in the absence of a lot of clear accountability and kind of clear paths forward to rebuilding, I think people can kind of wonder what the holdup is and wonder, like, why is it taking so long? And maybe in the absence of a lot of clear information, things like the president calling it a scam and, saying that the money just vanished, things like that can kind of circulate, because when you drive on the PCH, you still see just homes missing. You go through Altadena and you see just entire swaths of neighborhoods just gone and people displaced. I think it's like kind of fair to wonder, like, who's coming to help? And, when you see something like Fire Aid, which, I guess, to its credit, is full of artists that probably haven't had a lot of complimentary things to say about the Republican Party in California. And I think kind of maybe in the absence of sort of visible progress, maybe this idea that like it's a scam can take root. But, all I can speak to is my own reporting. And for what it's worth, I talked to every organization that was supposed to get money from Fire Aid. They all said they got it. You can not like the work that they do. You can think other things could have been chosen, but I don't think it's fair to say that Fire Aid is a scam.
I'll throw out my theory, which is when we bring up President Trump, he's very savvy about putting his name on everything from his buildings to his stakes. And do you think that maybe even some people who received the benefits of the Fire Aid money, they didn't know it was coming from Fire Aid because it was coming from this middleman nonprofit?
Sure, and maybe there's an argue that if, Billie Eilish had shown up at the door of the LA Regional Food Bank and said, here's the money from Fire Aid, maybe that would have kind of put two and two together for some people, watching. But it is both a blessing and a curse, I think, for the job of Fire Aid that they moved really, really quickly. And in a moment like that, you have to balance, do we want absolute total visible transparency on that, or do we want to get stuff done very quickly? And I think those two have to coexist. You have to kind of find ways to do it. And on FireAid's website, they're pretty transparent about here's the organizations that got money, here's more or less what they got, and here's what it went to. Maybe in with more of a rollout plan, you could have found a way to kind of make it more visibly hang a shingle out that says, we're rebuilding courtesy of FireAid. But that takes time and planning and resources, and every second the clock is ticking is a second that someone's still homeless or not getting clothes on their back, or their kids have no way to get to school. So I think they prioritize speed and efficiency maybe more than visibility outside of the concert, which was incredibly visible and incredibly celeb packed. I think people do kind of struggle just to understand how a tragedy of this kind of scale can happen so quickly, have a lot of money be raised, and have progress still be so slow and fitful. And the answer is really it's kind of the slow, ugly grind of the devastation is total, the work is immense, and the money that's going to need to go into rebuilding these things are so enormous, decimal points above anything that FireAid could ever hope to raise on their own. And I think people are kind of, in a way, mistaking FireAid for what government should be doing. I think there's, in a way, it surprises me that, FireAid has kind of taken all this heat that I think can better be directed at the federal government and the state government and city government, wondering why isn't rebuilding going faster? FireAid kind of suddenly became the meme of the moment with all of this, but the only organizations that can deliver hundreds of billions of dollars are the feds. Ask them.
Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with Rebuilding LA.
Hi, my name's Jordan and I'm a producer at LA Times Studios. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about our new sponsor, Ollie. Like many dog owners, my dog Zooms has become like a child to me. And with that type of responsibility comes the constant need to keep them happy and healthy. One way I make her mealtime a little bit better is through Ollie. Ollie delivers clean, fresh nutrition in 5 drool-worthy flavors, even for the pickiest eaters. Made in U.S. kitchens with the highest quality, human-grade ingredients, Ollie's food contains no fillers, no preservatives, just real food. And here's the thing. Healthier food means a happier pup. More energy, shinier coats, better poops, and more excitement at mealtime. Fill out Ollie's 30-second quiz and they'll create a customized meal plan based on your pup's weight, activity level, and other health info. For any first-timers, Ollie will send out your pup's first box with 2 weeks worth of meals, a free storage container for mess-free serving, and a guide of how to gradually switch them over to their new diet. Dogs deserve the best, and that means fresh, healthy food. Head to ollie.com/rebuildingla, tell them all about your dog, and use code RebuildingLA to get 60% off your welcome kit. Plus, they offer a happiness guarantee on the first box, so if you're not completely satisfied, you'll get your money back. That's ollie.com/rebuildingla and enter code RebuildingLA to get 60% off your first box.
During one of the most severe windstorms Southern California experienced in more than a decade, the Palisades and Eaton fires ignited, leaving heartbreaking losses in our communities. Now, as we build back, we're building stronger, cleaner, and more resilient. In communities most vulnerable to dangerous weather conditions and wildfires, Southern California Edison is placing power lines underground, hardening the electric system by installing wires with protective coating, and adding advanced technology to help keep communities safe. So when Southern California faces the next storm, the next most severe event,
Copy helicopters, structures adjacent to the Piper Road.
we'll be ready. Learn more at sce.com/disaster recovery.
It used to be that America could do big things. We built the interstate highway system. We did NASA. We built housing all over the country. We built enormous water systems and dams. We're not building big things anymore.
Mark Dunkelman's recent book, Why Nothing Works, examines why it is so difficult to build the critical infrastructure we need. From convoluted laws to overlapping regulations, Dunkelman looks at why the building of public infrastructure is more difficult here than in other developed countries.
We built up a series of checks within the system that now are so oppressive that even when someone comes with a good project that almost no one can object to, someone will find an objection.
Rebuild SoCal Partnership met Dunkelman at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, to talk about the infrastructure needs of California and the nation, and how government reform can make public decision-making more efficient. To dive deep into the conversation, stay tuned for the end of the episode.
And how are the organizers of Fire Aid responding to the backlash?
I think they recognize that there are certain corners of Los Angeles that suddenly are asking very pointed questions about where their fundraising went. And I think to their credit, they have been pretty quick to respond. They definitely have put out a lot of data and I think they have a pair of reports that are coming soon, kind of addressing some of these concerns very quickly about where this money all went to. And I think the last thing that they want is to have a cloud of uncertainty hanging over their organization and what they have done. I'm not necessarily one to stick up for the good nature of billionaires, but they did raise a ton of money very, very quickly to go to immediate aid in the community in which they all live and work. And you can have your qualms about kind of what they chose, but I don't know. If there was some there about this money not reaching the community, I would have loved to have found it. I didn't turn that up.
Well, and Fire Aid did hire a law firm to protect them through all of this. So where does all of this go from here?
Right. I think that's a testament to how kind of quickly the meme of Fire Aid's a scam kind of percolated through the right-wing media ecosystem and through social media. We have the President of the United States kind of weighing in on, this charity fundraiser concert. We have California elected officials calling for investigations into it. And, I'm sure Steve Ballmer is amply represented legally. But I think they saw very quickly this could be a real threat if the federal government or state, representatives that, can get Donald Trump's attention decide to prioritize this and make this a fruitful meme among their faithful that that Fire Aid was a scam. I think based on my reporting, I don't think Fire Aid was a scam. I think the money went to where they said it was going to go to. But there are corners in the federal government that may find it really useful to portray a star-studded California celebrity concert as a scam. I think there may be elements that might find that useful to them, and I'm sure Steve Ballmer might want to get out in front of that now.
Did you get a sense from Fire Aid that they're seriously concerned about an investigation?
I think the speed at which they wanted to get out in front of this showed that they're certainly taking it seriously. I have no idea what an investigation into this would yield because they've been pretty transparent about their accounting. And every time I've needed to ask them about that, they've responded pretty quickly. I think the only way that kind of their accusations might find some pickup among kind of locals is the idea that the money didn't help people that lost homes. That seems to be something that kind of comes up again in a lot of emails that I'm getting from people, is that I think a lot of people would have maybe rather this money go directly to cash grants to homeowners that lost homes in these fires rather than nonprofits providing social services to aid people that have been displaced by the fires. And I think Fire Aid is eager to speak to that and stamp out this idea that the money didn't get out the door. And I think they're happy to be held accountable if people don't like how they spent the money, but they have been pretty transparent about who was going to get it and about the fact that it got to where they said it was going to go to.
Is there still money left to be given out?
Yes, there is a final tranche of, I think, around $25 million that even smaller nonprofits are still open to apply for if they want to. But the hard part about the back end of this is a lot of this is through very kind of unglamorous stuff, paying for soil testing and helping people apply for permits. It is navigating the bureaucratic nightmare that is getting reimbursed by insurance companies to rebuild your home or just to get money to move on if you don't want to return. It's dealing with FEMA. I would rather go through dental surgery than have to deal with FEMA at this point in the process of navigating all of this. And that work is not going to be super visible to the general public, but it is having a law firm that can help you navigate it that's paid for by a Fire Aid grant is going to be a lifesaver to some people. a lot of the work kind of left to be done is extremely unglamorous and maybe even less urgent in the sense of a family of 5 that has been burned out of Altadena that needs somewhere to stay. The work that kind of remains to be done now is kind of a slow grind and thinking very long term and thinking, how do people rebuild their lives permanently? And that's not going to be super visible, but it's work that's super essential and needs to be done. And I think that's what this last round of grants is going to be focused on, is how do we rebuild in the long term and frankly, have a landscaping strategy to prevent fires in the future. I know talking to fire aid executives, that was one big thing, is how do we rebuild in a way that makes these communities more physically resilient to fire? And that's in the best case scenario, you never have to see it again because it worked.
Just one last big picture question, which is there's so many of these large benefit concerts that are kind of seared into pop culture memory. They become these milestones. What do you think will be the legacy of Fire Aid?
Yeah, there is a long storied history of things like Live Aid and Farm Aid and, the concert for Bangladesh, to reach back into the boomer archives here. And a lot of these were big, important cultural moments that, yielded music that met the moment. And I think the Fire Aid concert was really powerful as an Angelino to watch this kind of outpouring, not just for a kind of big macro problem, but a very specific need of, the world's center of the music industry. A lot of it got vaporized overnight. And here are all these artists that had intimate connections to these neighborhoods, that lost homes or studios or just cherished parts of a city where they had made their lives and work. I think maybe, over time, I have no idea how the concert itself is going to live on, but I think people are going to remember this moment in LA as a moment where we got made extremely clear how vulnerable we are to climate change and these sort of things that we take for granted, that the city that we know and love is going to be here tomorrow. It's not necessarily true. And these challenges are only going to escalate over time. And I hope that the legacy of this Fire Aid concert itself is both a reminder of people within the music industry that your history and your safety in this, corners of LA that can be very bucolic and lovely and facilitate such beautiful art making are really vulnerable and are going to only get more so in time. And we need to double down on the work that we need to preserve that now. LA is facing all sorts of challenges in preserving its status as a place for working artists to live, a place where culture can get made in a way that allows for a sustainable living for its artists. And, these fires are one way to tell ourselves that that's extremely fragile and not guaranteed. And I hope that the Fire Aid concert is a reminder that we have to work to preserve a livable city where music is still possible.
Well, August Brown, thank you so much for all your reporting on this. Thank you for following the money.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll have a link to his stories in our show notes. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts. And that's it for us today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. We'll be back here next week. See you then.
The following is a paid message from Rebuild SoCal Partnership. Sponsor has no editorial oversight.
Mark Dunkelman is a fellow in international and public affairs at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. In his recent book, Why Nothing Works, he explores the barriers to building the infrastructure that could match the scale of what we need as a country. Dunkelman sat down with John Switalski, executive director of Rebuild SoCal Partnership, to talk about our response to the devastating fires and the policies we need to rebuild efficiently.
The title of your book is provocative, Why Nothing Works. Can you tell us what isn't working and why not?
It used to be that America could do big things. We built the interstate highway system. We did NASA. We built housing all over the country. We built enormous water systems and dams. We're not building big things anymore. That's because we've created a system where there are so many vetoes. No one has the authority to sort of say, here are a whole bunch of costs and benefits to doing this big thing. I will weigh them against each other and make a decision. And that's because of reforms that we've made basically since the 1960s and 1970s.
In Los Angeles, we are now rebuilding in the communities of Altadena and Pacific Palisades. We hear that the cleanup is being done efficiently. Does it seem like that kind of efficiency is only done in time of emergency?
The other major example of that is rebuilding of 95 in Pennsylvania after it collapsed. There was a moment in time when people with too much discretionary power abused it and did things to people who were powerless that were outrageous, but we've now overcorrected. And so in too many cases, absent a crisis, you've got a situation where it's almost impossible to get good projects done.
A central critique in your book is how we approach infrastructure as a society. Why is that?
We built up a series of checks within the system that now are so oppressive that even when someone comes with a good project that almost no one can object to, someone will find an objection. Because at root, our movement is the one that wants to do big things for working people, and we're not able to accomplish that. So we are culpable for our own frustration.
You argue in your book that people don't like concentration of power. Can you talk about how that impacts infrastructure?
And then we got to a point in the 1960s, 1970s, where we saw that the people who had been empowered to make decisions were making bad decisions. The lesson that progressives took from that was that powerful individuals couldn't be trusted. But if you're going to do a big project, there are going to be costs and benefits, and someone needs to be able to weigh them. We need to make it so that everyone has a voice, but that no one has a veto.
What happens to a society that can no longer build what it needs?
We're in a situation right now where we can't build what needs to be built. We were in a similar situation at the turn of the 20th century. Corporate titans and robber barons, and they stopped projects from happening. And eventually, the public interest rose up and said, no, we're going to empower someone to make these decisions. But the core elements are the same. We've got too many vetoes in the system. And if we're going to get things done, we're going to need to empower someone to make these decisions.
We are going through a period of government reform in Southern California. What advice can you give to streamline the bureaucracy?
Even if I don't get the outcome that I want, what would be a process that would make me feel as though my concerns were heard and I will accept the outcome at the end of the day? As we re-engage the public and they see that the government does work, there will be sort of a virtuous cycle of people saying, I understand how that worked. I can imagine giving government power to do more in the future. We need to set up systems through charter changes, through changes of law, through changes in the way we do litigation that make it clear to people who ultimately has the power to choose.
What new story do we need to tell so that people realize that infrastructure projects can be built and have a positive impact on their lives?
The projects to clean up parts of Southern California that burned 6 months ago, that's an efficient, effective use of public power. And that people see that as the norm. The people that they look to solve those problems are efficient, effective government bureaucracies that can get through all the objections and get us to the best outcome. And so I think that's a slow process of our rediscovering the power of government to do good.
What are the costs of infrastructures in other modern countries compared to the United States?
What's so remarkable in the United States is that our infrastructure is orders of magnitude more expensive than other places that are also developed. The distinction is about the process we use to make decisions, these soft costs, and it's something that we really need to grapple with.
We're cleaning up the fires in LA, we're rebuilding. What general advice do you have?
LA's going through this torturous period where you're trying to rebuild from these devastating fires. And the challenge for us now is to say, in a moment of deep communal need, can we have the wherewithal to make decisions expeditiously? And ultimately, most everyone has the community's best interest in mind. People have different ideas about the way moving forward. And the thing that you need is ultimately to have someone be able to make the decision of which way we're going to go.
Rebuilding LA is hosted by and reported on by me, Kate Cagle. Our senior producer and showrunner is Megan Larson. Our associate producers are Jordan Patterson and Megan Botel. Our video director is Julia McCabe. Our director of post-production is Patrick Stewart. And our senior sound recording engineer is Nick Norton, with audio engineering help from David Iskandarian and motion graphics by Dougal Henkin. Our video editors are Peter Grayson and Daniel Flesher. Ben Church is our senior coordinating producer, and Anne-Marie Hauser is our production manager. Our podcast marketing manager is Bryn Jura, and our product marketing director is Becca Dorman. Our general counsel at the LA Times is Jeff Glasser. Special thanks to President and Chief Operating Officer of the Los Angeles Times, Chris Argenteri, and the Executive Editor of the Los Angeles Times, Terry Tang. Rebuilding LA is co-created by LA Times Studios President Anna Migzanian and executive produced and co-created by Darius Derrickson. And one final thank you to all the residents of Altadena and the Pacific Palisades for sharing your stories with us.